Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Graham Chapel for an exciting event sponsored by the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. I'm Holden Thorpe. I'm the provost of Washington University, and it's an honor to welcome all of you this evening for yet another exciting event in the several extraordinary weeks that we have had here on the Danforth campus with the debate happening here and an evening of extraordinary dialogues hosted by the center that I think many of you probably also attended a couple of weeks ago, and now a visit by Jon Meacham, who is such a great friend to the Danforth Center and to Washington University. I want to thank some of the people who do so much to make these kinds of things happen, and the first is my wonderful, terrific colleague Marie Griffith, who runs the Danforth Center. Marie, thank you for all you do for us. And of course, Jack and Sally Danforth, Senator, thank you for all that you have done to make this possible. So glad your family is here with us. Thank you all. It's exciting for us to be part of all of this. It's a thrill to introduce Jon Meacham. He is, as I said, a great friend to us and a very well-known person in politics and a perfect person to have here with us this evening. Jon is the Executive Vice President and Executive Editor at Random House. His latest book, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, was published by Random House in November of 2015. And his book, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, was a New York Times bestseller and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2009, cited as an unlikely portrait of a not always admirable Democrat, but a pivotal president, written with an agile prose that brings the Jackson saga to life. Some people in the Washington U community would know that I once donned leather pants and a Ramones t-shirt in order to appear in the Washington University production of Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, which has similar themes in it, and so I'm very familiar with Jon's work that changed the way we think about Andrew Jackson. I used to tell the kid playing Andrew Jackson, I said, your goal is that at the end of the show, everybody will take out their wallet and tear up all their $20 bills. His other New York Times bestsellers included Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, Franklin and Winston, An Intimate Portrait of an Epic Friendship, and American Gospel, God, the Founding Fathers, and The Making of a Nation. Jon appears on television frequently, and for those of us who are very interested in the election but also don't get off work until 8:30 or 9 o'clock, we're fans of a program called CNN Tonight with Don Lemon. Jon was on that program 2 nights ago, and I happened to be watching then. And Don Lemon they were talking about Barack Obama's statements during this campaign, and Jon volunteered that Barack Obama had been beer-bonging rhetoric. Well, I have to say, as a college administrator, that if you're going to beer-bong something, rhetoric is a great choice. Jon was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he says y'all like some other people around here. And he's a communicant of the St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, which has one of the greatest boys' choirs in all of the Episcopal Church. So I highly recommend you stop by there if you get a chance. He has, like I said, been a great friend of the Danforth Center. He is the chair of our National Advisory Board, and he gave the inaugural address at the birth of the Danforth Center. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Washington University our great friend, Jon Meacham.
Thank you. Thank you, Holden. I can safely say I've never worn a Ramones t-shirt or leather pants, which is really good news for every one of you, believe me, particularly the leather pants part. I'm delighted to be here. It was a very generous introduction, and whenever I think that, I have the world right where I want it, and that I've accomplished a great deal, and I should feel self-satisfied in some ways, my mind goes back to a moment on the Washington Mall, now about 8 years ago. and I was at the National Book Festival, and I was on my way to give my talk at that point about Andrew Jackson, and a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough as a basic rule, and said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes, Existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with." And this may be the only room in America where I can use existential as an adverb. She said, "Will you wait right here? I want you to sign your new book." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I was standing there thinking, I've got the world by the tail. Hand to God, she brought back John Grisham's latest novel. So, whenever I think everything is in place, I remind myself that somewhere in America there is a woman with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury. So, that is a true story. It's not even like the Bible, which is true but not accurate. That's actually both. Sorry, Senator. I'm delighted. Holden, thank you. Thank you to the Chancellor, to Marie, my fellow Chattanoogan, Coca-Cola, Crystal Hamburgers, Marie Griffin. We all came from Chattanooga. So what else do you want? Thank you. To my friends Jack and Sally Danforth, thank you so much. Senator Danforth has long been a formidable figure in the life of the nation and in the life of the church. We are, in fact, 2 of the last 6 Episcopalians. So sometimes we get together and try to change the bylaws. But his work in the Senate, his work in contributing to the life of the mind, and his most recent book in particular, are models for all of us in terms of presenting controversial ideas and dealing with the public square with grace and dignity and empathy. So thank you, sir. So here we go. That was the grace and empathy. Now we're going to talk about the campaign. I will say this as a biographer of George Herbert Walker Bush, there is something about the movement in the last 25 years from a Republican nominee and president who could not talk about himself that tends to disprove Darwin. So we'll get to that in a moment. It was Sunday, November 2nd, 1800, All Souls Day, and the President of the United States was writing a letter to his wife. It was John Adams' second night in the White House, barely habitable. He had just moved from 6th and Market Streets in Philadelphia to the wilderness on the Potomac, then known as the Federal City. Sitting down to write Abigail, he concluded with these words: "Before I end my letter, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." As we know, Adams's prayer has only been sporadically answered, like most prayers on this side of paradise. But like the country itself, the presidency has been shaped by religious thought, by religious impulses, and by religious rhetoric from the very beginning. In our broad national life, as we know, religion has been used to divide us as well as to unite us. It has been cited to enslave and exclude, as well as to liberate and to include. My focus in our time together this evening in this chapel and under the auspices of the Danforth Center, whose work I so admire, will be on the religious motivations and evocations of the presidents themselves. This is not, to be sure, a comprehensive view of religion and politics. It's rather an impressionistic, but if I may say so, deeply felt portrait of how a number of American presidents have gotten things largely right. The presidential task is clear but infinitely complex. Finding the balance between the invaluable American traditions of freedom of conscience and separation of church and state, and what I believe is the wholly reasonable Republican, lowercase r, Republican art of managing and marshaling the religious impulses of the people at large. So why focus on the presidency? Jefferson, for one, helps us to understand. He once said that the duty of the chief magistrate was to unite in himself or herself the confidence of the whole people in order to produce a union of the powers of the whole and point them in a single direction as if all constituted but one body and one mind. Henry Adams, the great historian, thought the President of the United States was like the captain of a ship at sea. He required a course to steer and a port to seek. John Kennedy called the Oval Office the vital center of action. First, a bit of background. For just over 50 years, the debate over the proper role of religion in our politics has had great force and urgency. You and I have discussed this before. The modern arguments about the role of faith in politics that began with the Supreme Court's decision to end mandatory school prayer in 1962 and accelerated with the Roe ruling in 1973 are not especially novel, but they are fierce. And just because something happened before doesn't mean it's not happening now. The right, broadly put, longs to engineer a return to what they believe was a prelapsarian Christian America. The left, broadly put, tends to believe that if only we could recapture the secular nature of the founding, then we could destroy the vestiges of what Jefferson once called monkish superstition. I think both views are off the mark. My own sense is that the great good news about the country, the American gospel, if you will, is that religion shapes the life of the nation without strangling it. It informs our virtues without tending toward theocracy and tyranny. St. Augustine once defined a nation as a multitude of rational beings united by the common objects of their love. I love that, Devin. I'll offer you that again. The multitude of rational beings united by the common objects of their love. It's the best definition of a nation I've ever come across. So the question becomes, what do you and I love in common here in the second decade of the 21st century? And I think it's fair to say that we don't love enough in common. We stare at screens, we pick and choose our news, we fail to know our neighbors very well, much less love them as ourselves. That's a painful truth. And while the way back, the way to find more common objects of our love, lies not just in politics, politics is essential, for we have no other way to govern our common lives. And it is at once a maker and a mirror of culture. That's one reason, beyond the obvious constitutional provisions, that the presidency is so important. For the American president, at least historically, can play an outsized role in the creation of culture. Jefferson embodied the Enlightenment, Jackson and Lincoln the rise of the democratic classes and self-made men, TR the hopes of the progressives, FDR the need for the state to ameliorate the ravages of the free market, Ronald Reagan the shift from New Deal liberalism to largely Sunbelt conservatism, Bill Clinton the high hopes of the baby boom generation. I think that for all of our divisions, for all of our differing opinions, for all of our competing interests, history itself has the capacity to bring us together. For the story of the American journey is ultimately the story of obstacles overcome, crises resolved, and freedom expanded. It is a historical fact that we have always grown in strength the wider we have opened our arms. And, not coincidentally, the more we've opened our hearts. We have never had as many immigrants in the United States as we have today. The most powerful Air Force in the world is the United States Air Force. Do you know what the second is? The United States Navies. We're doing just fine in terms of our capacity to project power and to force our will to maintain our integrity. And we've done it with a diverse nation. From Lexington and Concord to Lewis and Clark, from Fort Sumter to D-Day, from Seneca Falls to Selma, we've sought to perfect the Union. Sometimes we've gotten it right, sometimes wrong, but the journey goes on. So what can we learn from the past in our own time? I would argue that we should learn that the perfect should not be the enemy of the good, that compromise, that apparently dirty word, used not to be, but now it appears to be 4 letters. That compromise itself is the oxygen of democracy, and that we learn the most from those who came before, not by looking up at them uncritically or down on them condescendingly, but looking them in the eye and taking them for what they were in their time. George Washington was the first to find the right balance between protecting a role for the faithful and keeping the state out of the tangles of theology and the tyranny of coercion. Writing to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island in 1790, he assured his Jewish countrymen that America would give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. In a treaty with the Muslim nation of Tripoli, initiated by Washington, completed by John Adams, and ratified by the Senate in 1797, I want to say that again because the Senate actually ratified something. Danforth left, the whole thing fell apart. Amazing. In 1797, that was after your second term, wasn't it, sir? Is he laughing? The founders declared that the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. The wall of separation that Thomas Jefferson referred to in his 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists divides church from state. The wall metaphor originated with Richard Hooker, the Anglican divine, comes through the American experience, through Roger Williams, was picked up by Jefferson, did not really play a significant role in the life of the nation until it was used in 1947 by Hugo Black. But the wall of separation was as much about protecting the church from the state as it was the state from the church. And it was also had no intention, no meaning of separating religion from politics. Church and state are institutions. They are clearly delineated and definable. Religion and politics are both about people. They're about our hopes, our fears, our ambitions, our aspirations. They are both rooted in words that fundamentally go back to the human condition, religion, ligare, to tie together. Politics, the Greek word for city was defined as a collection of people. So from the pagan sources through the Christian theology of Augustine forward, religion was about bringing people together. And it was never Jefferson's intention. It's not possible to separate religion and politics because it would be like asking someone to put aside their economic interests, their geographic interests, their human interests, to ask them to somehow draw a mythical line in themselves to put one thing on one side and another on the other. But foregoing an established church, the founders did allow something called public religion. The phrase is Benjamin Franklin's, although it goes back to Machiavelli and Plato, for something called public religion to take root. And I want to share with you part of a letter that the very aged Benjamin Franklin wrote to the president of Yale right before his death, meaning Franklin's. Ezra Stiles had written to Franklin asking him to share his views on Jesus and the question of divinity. And this is what Benjamin Franklin, close to his deathbed, wrote back. I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be the fundamental principles of all sound religion, and I regard them as you do, in whatever sect I meet with them. As to Jesus of Nazareth, I think the system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. But I apprehend it has received various corrupting changes, and I have some doubts as to his divinity, though it is a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I soon expect an opportunity of learning the truth with less trouble. One hopes that worked out for the old boy. Jefferson himself believed firmly in the primacy of reason over revelation. He even created his own Bible. Like Henry II, Andrew Jackson disliked turbulent clergymen and was unimpressed when a leading Presbyterian of the day preached a sermon entitled "The Duty of Christian Freemen to Elect Christian Rulers." He disagreed with the Sabbatarian movement to stop the delivery of mail on Sundays. One Jacksonian argued that it made as much sense to ask the Navy to pull down its sails so the wind would not move our ships about the seas on Sundays. Abraham Lincoln saw the Civil War as an act of divine will that passed all understanding. It was, Lincoln believed, one of God's impenetrable mysteries. He grounded the cause of union in religiously inspired ideas of equality and liberty. And is there any more theologically sound notion in the history of American public rhetoric than the words "with malice toward none, with charity for all"? Theodore Roosevelt believed in the exhortation in the General Epistle of St. James to be doers of the word and not hearers only, and he defended the Unitarian William Howard Taft from evangelical attacks during the presidential challenge of William Jennings Bryan. The only public statement Franklin Roosevelt made on D-Day, June 6, 1944, was to read a prayer he had written drawing on the 1928 Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. Dwight Eisenhower opened his cabinet meetings with prayers. One afternoon, he had a lot of business on his mind. When he sat down, he went straight into the agenda. About 20 minutes later, he said, "Jesus Christ, we forgot the goddamn prayer." Oh, boy. We're okay. John Kennedy closed his inaugural address with the point that on earth God's work must truly be our own. Lyndon Johnson's great civil rights speeches drew heavily on the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as he spoke of the long-delayed deliverance of a people. Gerald Ford's pardon message about Richard Nixon explicitly evoked a religious notion of mercy. Ford wrote in the speech he gave on that Sunday morning in September of 1974 that he believed he had to be merciful to President Nixon, partly on the grounds that he himself was ultimately going to need mercy beyond time. It's a remarkable document. I commend it to you. Jimmy Carter mainstreamed the evangelical world into American politics and foreshadowed Barack Obama's own theological sensibility by quoting Reinhold Niebuhr, who said, "The sad duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world." Ronald Reagan was not afraid to say that he saw the world as a struggle between light and dark. And as Senator Danforth pointed out in his eulogy for President Reagan, President Reagan always talked about a shining city on a hill. One of the remarkable things about Ronald Reagan is he may be the only rhetorician I can think of who could improve on Jesus. Because Jesus just talked about a city on a hill. It was Reagan who added the key adjective, that it was a shining city on a hill. And I don't actually read all of his speeches in the red letter version, so it's a fair point. He called the Soviet Empire the focus of evil in the modern world, and even George Herbert Walker Bush, the least emotional of Christians. President Bush thought that being born again was like a mulligan. I need one sometimes, you know. Anyway, I interviewed Dana Carvey when I did the biography of him, and the key insight was, I said to Carvey, "How did you build your impression of Bush?" And he said, "Well, the key to doing George Herbert Walker Bush is Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne." And it's actually kind of perfect, you know. Not gonna do it, you know. I've spent a lot of time around these people. It comes and goes, you know. Even he, the least emotional, opened his inauguration with a prayer of his own composition. He wrote it out on cards, and it's a remarkable document. The key line is, give us power to help people, not to make a great show in the world or a name, not to make a great show in the world or a name, but to help people. We could use some of that humility today. Bill Clinton was soaked in the religious imagery of sin and redemption and deliverance and needed all of that. George W. Bush would not, it's low-hanging fruit, but fruit tastes good, you know. God's given us, he's given us at least 4 more years of him, so it's going to be good. And George W. Bush would not have been president had he not, in the middle of his journey, found a religious faith that informed his sense of mission. President Obama, too, found in the traditions of the African American church an identity, a place to call home, seeing new and personal meaning in the stories of old. Which brings us to 2016. Pop your Zoloft, here we go. My own view is that on the Republican side, as I said, the movement from Bush to Trump, from 1988 or so to 2016, is quite, as Hamlet would say, quite a falling off there. We have a choice this year between one of the most conventionally prepared candidates in our history and perhaps the least conventionally prepared. This is not a partisan point. I have voted for candidates of both parties. I expect to continue to do so. A devoted Methodist, a reader of Tillich, who attended a sermon by Martin Luther King in Chicago as a teenager, Hillary Clinton, for all her shortcomings, respects the norms of our political and cultural milieu. Donald Trump, as a clinical observation, simply does not. It's actually not simple, really. His rise is about a fundamentally important force. It's about resentment. It's about, and I think his own behavior in the public square is more about provocation than enlightenment. He is ultimately more ringmaster than he is realist, more about bombast than belief. Interestingly, explicitly religious issues have not been as central to this campaign as one would have thought, but then there's nothing normal about this campaign. My view is that those strongly religious folks who support Trump out of their recent loyalty to the Republican Party will come to regret it in the fullness of time, win or lose. But why Trump at all? In part because he is playing on fears of American decline that are not of his creation, but are as old as the Republic. The imminence of chaos, of a nation torn asunder, of a country in imminent danger and at risk of being irretrievably lost, has been a standard political trope from the very beginning. In 1788, Patrick Henry said, "I conceive the Republic to be in extreme danger." In 1808, John Adams observed, "Commerce, luxury, and avarice have destroyed every Republican government. We mortals cannot work miracles. We struggle in vain against the course of nature." And they were saying all this without inspiring Alec Baldwin. So, such political language was prevalent in the 18th century and is now nearly universal in the first years of the 21st. Apocalyptic imagery particularly recurs in national campaigns, seasons of decision that, while in progress, can seem dispiriting and extreme. Yet, what is remarkable about America, about the country, is her durability and adaptability amid the perpetual crises and vicissitudes of history. It's a durability and an adaptability that the finest American presidents, the finest American leaders, the finest American publics have nurtured and preserved. And I'm not being sentimental. I have a weakness for sentiment, but this is not such a moment. There was undeniably a genius about the American founding and the emergence of American democratic politics, particularly the conception, birth, and ratification of the Constitution. And that genius lay in no small part because it lays in the recognition that the Republic was as susceptible to human passions as human beings themselves. It's perhaps our finest insight. Governments, states are as susceptible to human passions as we are ourselves. The founders expected seasons of anger and frustration. They anticipated hours of unhappiness and unrest. Alexander Hamilton, current rap star. I must say quickly, as a biographer of Thomas Jefferson, I wish him all the success in the world, but if you have any rap lyrics that involve Monticello, please see me afterward. When I was out talking about Jefferson, this is totally parenthetical, but I was basically, when I would be out talking about Jefferson, a lot of people would raise their hand and say, oh, well, I'm a Hamiltonian. That meant they were a banker. That's what that means. And Chris Christie asked me to come out to have lunch in Trenton with him when I was doing the Jefferson book. And this is before Christie became Patty Hearst. It was back then. And so we sat down, and, oh, come on. Can't you see him in front of that flag with the gun? And we sat down, and he's a lovely man. And we sat down, and he said, well, you know, I'm really more of a Hamilton guy. And I said, well, that's great, Governor, but, you know, at least my guy didn't get shot in Jersey. And the damnedest thing happened. I couldn't get back into the city. Underreported part of that scandal. Where the hell was I? Let's see. Okay. Hamilton said, why has government been instituted at all? He asked in the Federalist Papers. And his answer was telling. Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. A recognition of weakness. The country was thus constructed with an awareness of sin and a recognition that we needed redemption, and that redemption would probably come beyond time, not within time. So we had to guard against the wages of our own fallen world, an explicitly religious idea at the heart of the country, right next to the idea that we are all born with the divine ability, the divine right to determine our own destiny. The American Revolution, the American experiment of which we continue to be a part, is, I think, the greatest political manifestation of the most important shift in the history of Western thought, which was from life being organized vertically, the rights of kings, princes, prelates, and popes, to determine by either accident of birth or incident of election what the destiny of everyone else would be, to the fact that we were all born with that capacity, with that right to determine that destiny. The shift from a vertically organized society to a horizontal one, which as well has deep religious roots, particularly within Christian theology. We have to protect, the founders taught us, we have to protect this larger enterprise from the furies of the moment. And presidents have often been the tip of the spear. We live in a moment where fury seems constant. And I think that we have to grapple with why it is that those furies are loose, particularly to understand what St. Paul might call the sufferings of the present time. In an essay on anger, Seneca, one of the great Roman Stoics, noted that wise men had long said that anger is a brief madness. And then he wrote something that I'd like you to listen to with some care, if you would, and see if any face comes to mind. This is Seneca on anger. As madmen exhibit specific symptoms, a bold and threatening expression, a knitted brow, a fierce set of features, a quickened step, restless hands, a changed complexion, frequent, very forceful sighing. So do angry people show the same symptoms. Their eyes blaze and flicker. Their faces flush deeply as the blood surges up from the depths of the heart. Their lips quiver and their teeth grind. Their hair bristles and stands on end. Their breathing is forced and ragged. At her best, America has recognized this perennial role of anger in public life and found ways to manage that popular rage in the public square. I don't think we can see where we are now and where we have to go without visiting the work of Richard Hofstadter, the great Columbia historian who in 1963 delivered a lecture at Columbia that later became a Harper's cover story and then still later a book, talking about what he called the paranoid style in American politics, a persistent pattern of extreme conspiratorial theories about fundamental threats to the country. Hofstadter wrote this: "The paranoid spokesman traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He is always manning the barricades of civilization. He constantly lives at a turning point. It is now or never in the organizing resistance to conspiracy. Time is forever running out." Ranging from fears of the Bavarian Illuminati in the 1790s to the dark anxieties of the anti-communist John Birch Society in the 1960s, Hofstadter identified the recurrent tendency to see powerful forces at work to undermine life or politics, or often both. And there are surely elements of the paranoid style at work at this moment in our common life. From antiquity forward, statesmen and philosophers have pondered and practiced the rhetorical arts, the creation and delivery of arguments designed to move a broader audience to a particular action or particular choice. A key element of political discourse has long been the deployment of imagery of conflict and the assertion of ultimacy. "We must do what I think we must do," the speaker says, "or everything will be lost." And it is true that our most successful political figures, from Jefferson and Hamilton to Jackson and Lincoln to TR and FDR and JFK and Reagan, have been masters of casting political choices in dramatic and occasionally hyperbolic terms. TR said this in 1912, "I hope we shall win, but win or lose, we shall not falter. Our cause is based on the eternal principle of righteousness, and even though we who may lead now for a time may fail, in the end the cause itself shall triumph. We stand at Armageddon, and we battle for the Lord." Could have come straight off Fox News. In the closing weeks of the 1948 campaign, President Truman implicitly compared Thomas E. Dewey to Hitler and Mussolini. Speaking on behalf of Barry Goldwater in 1964, 52 years ago tomorrow night, Ronald Reagan made his national political debut in an NBC broadcast. He was ordinarily the most optimistic of political figures, and yet he told that audience that the stakes of the election of 1964 were existential. "You and I have a rendezvous with destiny," Reagan said, echoing that old phrase of FDR's. And then he said this: "We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness." Now, it was an important election, but was the choice of Lyndon Johnson really the beginning of a millennium of despair? And I don't think so. But that's the perennial nature of politics. In the American context, from the battle of the Constitution to the emergence of Jacksonian democracy, from the war for union to the struggle to save democratic capitalism in the age of Roosevelt, from the icy fears of the Cold War to the gloomy years of the 1970s, the story of the nation has in many ways been one of perpetual crisis and provisional consensus. And what has helped get us through, and what presidents have understood and our leaders have understood and what all of us at our best have understood, is that religiously based values of grace and empathy and dignity and charity have been the balm, the social lubricant, if you will, to check our worst passions and to lead us to actually be able to hear, maybe not heed, but certainly hear what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. Politics will always disappoint us because politics is of this world, and this world will always disappoint us. It is fallen, it is frail, it is a dark and dangerous place. What redeems it, what redeems all of our lives, are those personal virtues that at its best, America has been able to make political virtues. As partisanship will be with us forever, the key is that it not be reflexive partisanship, I should not disagree with what you say simply because you're the one saying it. If you're on the other side of the aisle and you stand up to offer an opinion and I dismiss it without thought, then I am foreclosing my own capacity to use my God-given gift of reason. I can disagree with you after I think about what you say. That's the point of democracy. That's the point of self-government, is to disagree in an agreeable way. But if I shut you off simply because you are the source of the idea, then I am undercutting the democratic promise, and I am failing to live up in my own tradition to my duty as a person. Jefferson once noted that divisions of opinion have defined free societies since such questions convulsed Greece and Rome. The art of politics lies in the manufacturing of a workable consensus on a given problem for a given period of time, not unanimity, for unanimity is the most elusive of things and should in and of itself be distrusted, I would argue. The appreciation of that art is one of the critical things separating the 2016 Republican nominee from those who have held the office to which he aspires. For them, rhetoric that tended to the apocalyptic, see TR, see Reagan, was a means to an end, the end being the amassing of power in order to govern largely within the buoys of convention, including the protection of religious liberty and the preservation of the opportunity for religious feeling to flourish if it would. For Trump, apocalyptic rhetoric appears not to be a means to an end, but an end to itself. Now, every generation, it is true, tends to think of itself as uniquely challenged and uniquely under siege. The questions of the present assume urgent importance, for they are, after all, the questions that shape and suffuse all our lives. Humankind seems to be forever coping with crisis, and we can strike the seams. We are always coping with crisis. Crisis itself is rooted in the Greek word crisis with a K. It's coming out of Hippocrates. A crisis is a moment in a disease where the patient takes a definitive turn one way or the other. And so we live in this constant moment where we face constant choices about the shape and nature of life. And we're going to be that way until, as Faulkner once put it, the last red and dying evening, and maybe even beyond that. Now I want to say a word about the moral utility of history. This is something that is particularly vivid, I think, on college campuses now as institutions revisit the historical nature of the names of buildings, the legacies of the past. And my own former subject, Andrew Jackson, who recently found himself evicted from the $20 bill in favor, rightly, of Harriet Tubman. Old Jackson didn't have much of a chance there. Jackson once said, by the way, that his only two regrets in public life were that he had not hung Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, and shot John C. Calhoun, who was his vice president. No one felt that way about their running mate until John McCain. It's actually true. Total drive-by. That's what that was. But I want to talk for a second about the moral utility of history, because I think this is so important. Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian, whom I miss all the time, Arthur died the way we should all go, in a New York steakhouse on his second martini. That's our kind of guy. He once said that self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap. Self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap. And so when we begin to condemn posterity for slavery or Native American removal or denying women their full role in the life of the nation, I think we should pause and think. Not so much about how benighted and blighted previous generations were, but what in our own time are we ignoring for reasons of cultural or economic or political convenience, that posterity, the future, is going to look back on us and wonder why we didn't do the right thing? If the best and brightest of a previous generation are able to get such big things wrong, Lord knows what we're getting wrong. And so I think we should use the past not to make ourselves feel better, but to prod ourselves to action that might be uncomfortable, but which is ultimately the right thing. To know that we have met and solved seemingly intractable problems in ages past should give us hope for years to come. The knowledge that Americans at home and abroad have struggled and sacrificed and fought for the good, opposing totalitarianism and seeking to expand the vision of human rights enshrined in the Declaration, can itself, at its best, be an Augustinian common object of our love. And to know what's come before and to know how to think about our own problems in terms of seemingly disparate and distant events in relation to our own hour is to be armed against despair. If the men and women of the past, with all their flaws and limitations and ambitions and appetites, could press on through ignorance and superstition, racism and sexism, selfishness and greed, to form a more perfect union, then perhaps we too can right wrongs and leave the world, the stage, a better place than we found it. For our finest hours, the Revolutionary War, abolition, the expansion of the rights of women, hot and cold wars against terror and tyranny, the battle against Jim Crow, can partly be traced to religious ideas about liberty, justice, and charity. Yet, it is true, theology and scripture have also been used to justify our worst hours, from enslaving people based on the color of their skin to treating women as second-class citizens. By and large, American presidents from Washington forward, American publics from Washington forward, have had little interest in pursuing explicitly sectarian agendas. They have, of course, pursued partisan agendas, and those agendas have had religious components. But by and large, presidents who command the widest view of the whole democratic ground have exemplified the best of the American tradition of faith and of politics, which is to protect liberty of conscience and create room for conscience to play a role in the life of the nation. And yet, it is absolutely the case, and I think we've been reminded again every hour almost in recent months, that we are forever just a step or two away from darkness, from tyranny, injustice, exclusion. The rise of populist anger that has culminated in the nomination of the incumbent Republican nominee is proof enough of an ancient truth that the paranoid style in American life is alive and well. We must be forever vigilant, and I would suggest that the proper habits of heart and mind of religious believers can offer a way forward. The forces that brought this particular political moment to being cannot be ignored, and we ignore them at our peril. There are genuine concerns, there are genuine anxieties abroad in the land, and to dismiss them because of the faults of a single man who has presented himself as the champion of those people is to miss the mark. We have an obligation, one to another in a democracy, to care not only for the least of these, but for the one we disagree with the most. That's what makes this country different. That's what separates us from a Hobbesian state of nature. If we can find a way to engage with those whom we disagree with so violently, then in fact we are being true, I believe, to both the American creed and to the religious ideas that help shape that creed. For the religious folks among us, including me, I would remind myself and you that to force others to share your beliefs is a sin. Even God, in creating us with free will, declined to compel obedience. Who then is any man to try to do so? Coercion does not lead to conviction. Charity, grace, and empathy are the virtues we need now and all the length of days. I'll leave you with this, ending where we began with John Adams, who was once musing on the nature of his faith. And he wrote this: "I hate polemical politics and polemical divinity. My religion is founded on the love of God and my neighbor, on the hope of pardon for my offenses, upon contrition, upon the duty as well as the necessity of enduring with patience the inevitable evils of life, in the duty of doing no wrong, but all the good I can, to the creation of which I am but an infinitesimal part. I would argue that that's not a bad creed for any of us, president or citizen, believer or skeptic. Thank you very much. Thank you. Got the dog. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Jon for a wonderful lecture. There's so much there that we can talk about. We have about a half hour for Q&A. So I invite you. There are going to be microphones, people with microphones on both sides of the far aisles. If you would raise your hand, you'll get a mic passed down to you, and please, after you ask your question, pass it back down the aisle so we can move on. I know a lot of people will have questions. I'm going to take the privilege I have here, which I don't usually do, to ask you the first question.
The answer is no.
It has to. Thank you, Leslie. It has to do with anger, the anger that you talked about, and that we've seen throughout history. It's a great reminder of that, but we see it so strongly now. How do you think? What happens to that anger after November 8th, and how can it best be not just safely channeled, but really addressed? You know, really confronted, and the concerns really addressed.
Well, if I knew that, I would be running. I will point out that according to the New York Times website, at the moment, Secretary Clinton has a 93% chance of becoming president, and Trump is at 7, which is only 7 points above all of us. So we could announce and maybe close the gap. So the question is a great one, and it can't simply be dismissed. November 9th is the end of a campaign, but the beginning of everything else. I think that two numbers are the numbers I think of to explain how we got here. One is 19%. Only 19% of Americans trust the federal government to do the right thing some or most of the time. It's down from 77% in 1965. So in 1965, 3/4 of Americans trusted Washington. Today, fewer than 1 in 5 do. So in that gap, you have an immense room for a populist like the Republican nominee. Second number is 135,000. That's what the White House estimates is the household income required to produce a middle-class life for a family of 4. Car for the grown-ups, save a little bit of money, go on vacation every year. Household income at the moment is $57,500. So that missing $70,000 or so, $75,000 or so, is part of the reason we're in this moment. And I think that it is obviously it's about globalization and its discontents. It's about the fact that people do believe that the promise of American life, which is that if you work hard and play by the rules, the next generation will be better off than this generation. And the economic component of that promise has been broken for over 25 years now. And so until there is economic growth, I don't think the anger is going away. If there is economic growth, I think that it will start to dissipate. But if I were in Washington, that would be probably the true end of the republic. But the thing that I would focus on all the time is the creation of jobs, the creation of more wealth, because we know from history that democracy, stability, liberty does not precede economic growth, but proceeds from it. The Protestant what was going on in the Western world in the 2 or 3 centuries before the American Revolution? The Protestant Reformations, the translation of sacred scripture into the vernacular, and the rise of the bourgeoisie. The European Enlightenment, the Scottish Moral Enlightenment, all this idea I talked about vertical to horizontal. But economic growth was essential because suddenly people felt they had the standing, the security to assert themselves, they had something to defend, they had a way to shape their own destiny. If you have a full belly and that belly is full because of your own labor, you are a happier, more productive citizen. That's simply the lesson of history.
Thank you. I should say that John asked me to play traffic cop, so I will call on you as you ask your questions.
I'm going to hate to have to call on you. It's going to be embarrassing for everybody. Excuse me.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
You said early on that compromise was a thing that we sorely lack. And
Yeah.
it seems like we lack it at a level not seen since perhaps the Civil War. What's it going to take for us to find that art again?
It's a great question. Senator Danforth wrote a whole book about this. I fear that it's going to require a great crisis, and we've had two in recent times, both the attacks of September 11th and then the financial meltdown that ultimately did not create the kind of consensus that one would hope for. So I'm not sure exactly what kind of crisis begins to do that. There are very few raw political incentives for compromise. Members of Congress, members of the House, by and large, are in districts in which the only election that truly matters is the primary. I remember a lawmaker saying to me, well, I'd never heard primary used as a verb once. He said, I can't do that because I'd get primaried. You know, conjugate that 3 times. I shall have been primaried. So that's difficult. Only about 40 seats in the House are truly swing seats, which is kind of remarkable. Senators, I think, face the same issue. So I think actually, and this is kind of a gooey answer, but it also, as Dr. Kissinger used to say, has the virtue of being true. I think it's up to all of us. I think we have to incentivize compromise. We have to vote in a way, talk in a way, communicate in a way that grants lawmakers the space and the oxygen to make compromises and believe they're not going to pay for it at the polls. And if we don't do that, it's not going to happen. It's behavioral economics. It's not any, I mean, it's at once infinitely complicated to do it, but it's pretty straightforward. And what's happened in particular in the last 25 years or so is because of cable television, because of talk radio, because of the digital revolution, the extremes now have the capacity to whip up flash mobs and keep the energy is with the extremes and not the middle. And the middle has to find a way to address that, and it has to be all of us. We always talk about leadership. I'm a big fan of followership. You know, what is it that we have to do to enable this to happen? Because the issue is not, Jack and I have talked about this, the issue is not that members of Congress are out of touch with Washington. The problem is they're too damn in touch. I mean, out of touch with the country. They're too much in touch with their constituents, and they're too much in touch with constituents who speak the loudest. They may not be the most of them, but they're the loudest. And so if you believe that, you know, that basically your neighbors and your friends are the great middle, and if only you could organize and take care of it, then you have to try to organize and take care of it. Otherwise, I don't quite see how it changes. Totally parenthetically, a lot of the forces that gave us this particular moment took shape in the late 80s and early 90s, including the rise of talk radio. And all great political leaders master the means of communication of their time, right? So Jefferson and Lincoln wrote quickly and well for the newspapers. Churchill, Roosevelt understood the radio. Jack Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, fantastic TV performers. Bill Clinton and Ross Perot mastered cable television. Impossible to imagine Ross Perot without Larry King, right? And Clinton understood that he really needed to break through and be a presence in the popular culture as well as the political culture. And so remember, Bill Clinton went on Arsenio Hall. Remember that? George Herbert Walker Bush thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Andover. He had no idea. I took Spanish there, no clue. But one of the reasons he lost is Perot's on Larry King saying, that's tragic. And Clinton's going, hey, Arsenio. And poor Bush is like, where's the gin? So it was just a terrible time. Just wanted to get that in. That's what we call a rider in the legislative process. Where are you?
Clear history in Northern Ireland.
Oh, there you are.
Sunni versus Shia, and Northern Ireland, Sunni versus Shia. There are many, many other examples. I'm curious if you think that the salve to soothe our passions is religion. Is there these virtues that you cite, religious virtues? Is there a single one that you can say is uniquely religious and cannot be simply described as something that a secular humanist could also say is an important virtue?
No, but in point of fact, as a historical matter, as a clinical matter in the American experience, they did come out of a religious tradition. I totally understand that this is potentially one of the most divisive forces, if not the most divisive force, since the first caveman hit the first other caveman with a rock on the savannah. I get that. But it's also ahistorical to act as though the European Enlightenment was not working off a monotheistic tradition and understanding of individual worth that helped along the thinking about the centrality of the individual. That's why the tradition of American religious liberty is so important, and the liberty from religion is so important. And I believe in it not just for secular, political, constitutional reasons, but for religious ones. If you try to compel obedience, you're in the wrong place religiously. And it's an oxymoron, but religious people, the first step has to be humility. It's why I'm against creches in public places, because I think Lord knows, I think, starting here, we have enough real estate we can decorate, right? There are enough churches that, by the way, don't pay taxes. I'm sure, well, no, y'all wouldn't. But I think there has to be a humility, or you're on the road to tyranny. And you can justify it in your head by thinking you're doing the divine thing. And boy, that's the scariest voice to start hearing. I live in Tennessee. It's called getting up. Yeah. It's a great question. And I should say, I'm a gun owner. The safest, if you are a quail, the safest place to be is near me when I have a gun. Kind of like Dick Cheney and his trial lawyers, But that was the old joke that, that was just a good start. No, you put your finger on it, and I think that's the great conservative example. I think that if there were a conservative talking about it, there would probably be someone who would find that NARAL or some of the more significant pro-choice groups would be also irrational in some way. So let's be fair about this. Deeply held opinions are the price of doing business. But it is also, again, a historical fact, which is how I always try to judge these things, is not a priori, but a posteriori, is what does experience tell us about how we get through these things? And by and large, compromise has been the right way. I find the gun laws issue particularly frustrating because I'm willing to do just about anything. I mean, I'm sort of a lefty on this. If the government wants to know I have a gun, fine, I'll tell them. So I'm out of step particularly with my state. I mean, I live in a state where 94 out of 95 counties voted for Mr. Trump in the primary, I was speaking with a very senior elected official of the state 8 days before the primary, and I said, what's going to happen? And he said, well, I don't know anybody who's for Trump. So you can tell he's in his second term. He really had his finger on the pulse there. Also, just for what it's worth, I had a conversation with the governor of Arkansas the same season after the Arkansas primary, and he told me that after the Republican primary, on the night of the primary, he thought the computers in Little Rock were broken because so many people were coming out to vote that precincts that in previous elections had had 70, 80 people were having 700 and 800 people. And he actually thought there was a zero problem, that a zero was being added to the totals. And so it's one of the reasons that in some of these states, I think this is an unpollable election. I think there are a lot of people who are not being counted in the various social science things. So how do you, if I may slightly take the liberty of rephrasing your question, how do you deal with people who hold views that are so anathema to you and hold them so strongly? That's the tragedy of history. That's what Chesterton said, we have to permit the twilight. We just have to keep fighting it, and whether for whatever issue it is. And it's why great leaders are needed. It's why followers have to create the space for those leaders to make a decision. There are more people, according to every poll, there are more people who agree with, I suspect, the position you hold than there are members of the NRA. So where are they? Why aren't they protecting the senators? Why aren't they protecting the members of the House? Why aren't they marching in order to overcome the organized opposition? It's an episodic fight. Oh, sure. It's on.
If there was one president that you could bring back that might get us through this, dead or alive?
Dead or alive. Are we off the record? Just kidding. Oh my God. Next. No. I don't know. I mean, one of the reasons I started doing this, started writing biographies, is I was a working journalist for a long time, 25 years. And right around in the late 90s or so, I started wondering whether, given that everything that public people did led the press to either make fun of them or attack them for their stupidity or limited vision, sort of this reflexive cynicism that you kick people in the shins just because you have a leg and so do they. I started wondering, I wonder what the editors of Time and Newsweek said about Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, I wonder if they thought in real time, was this guy what we think he is now? And so I went back and looked, and they didn't like him. He was criticized all the time. The cover of Newsweek about D-Day, the week after, it was a special issue. D-Day was on Tuesday. It was a special issue, came out at the end of the week. Most of the story was about why didn't they plan for the hedgerows. It was this forward-leaning thing about the problem. All right, how are we going to get to Berlin? Giving them no credit for the fact they had just launched the most important amphibious invasion in the history of man. And so part of me wanted to, I sometimes call this the Friday Night Lights principle. You may remember in the TV show Friday Night Lights, about a Texas football team, redundant. The sign in the locker room was clear eyes, full heart. And what I try to do is I try to see everything clearly. I try to call it as I see it. But I try to do so with a full heart because I think that most of the people in public life are there for good reasons. And I like politicians. It's a character flaw of mine. But we have no other way to conduct our public affairs, so we need them as a basic rule. Would I love to have Andrew Jackson back for sport? Sure. You'd love to see how Lincoln would have handled Reconstruction. And I miss 41. Now he's on my mind, obviously, because I've just spent all these years with him in my head. But, there have been moments where we've had people, senators, governors, presidents, who have in fact put the good of the country, the good of their state, ahead of short-term political need. And we haven't had that much lately. But George H.W. Bush, for instance, when he broke his no new taxes pledge in 1990, he told his diary in a very presidential phrase, "I'm probably going to be dead meat, but I need to do it." And he was willing to sacrifice a second term. This is not retrospective, him trying to clean up what happened. This is in the diary that day. He knew that he would probably pay the ultimate price. And so, insofar as we've had folks, and again, not just leaders, but publics as well, where we were willing to make a sacrifice for the greater good is a good thing. As Winston Churchill once said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possibility. There's somebody in the back, I think. There's a young woman in the back. You'll notice I skipped the Morning Joe question.
So, one of the things that has occurred during this election cycle has been the coincidence of the rise of social media and Trump's sort of xenophobic rhetoric. And it's created this legitimization of xenophobia and provided a platform for the alt-right. And my question to you is, as a historian, do you see a parallel or a connection between what's occurring now with the alt-right and all of this very negative rhetoric towards minorities and what occurred with the rise of Hitler?
Let me stay in the American context, if you will, if you don't mind. Fully comparative stuff with other countries makes me nervous because of the difficulty of comparison. But the existence of a vibrant, conspiracy-driven media is as old as the country itself. In the 1790s, the Federalists believed so strongly that immigrants and the press were conspiring to steal the country that they passed what? The Alien and Sedition Acts. There was actual legislation to deport people and to shut down newspapers that John Adams found to be out of line with where he wanted it to be. So in the 1790s, you had the Federalists acting, I guess we can call it the alt-federal, Adams-Bart. So you have that on that side, and that created, like all physical actions, it created a reaction. And you had the Jefferson-Madison Republican Party that became even more conspiracy-minded about the ambitions of Federalists to bring back a British monarch, to hand over the country to the British. And so you had in both the 1796 campaigns and the 1800 campaigns a constant Jeffersonian concern that, in fact, Hamilton was in New York meeting with agents of the British government and conspiring to take New England and New York, and they would join Nova Scotia. These are live fears. As Richard Nixon taught us, even paranoids have enemies. So there was reason to worry about it. Andrew Jackson was like this. Jackson believed that in 1824 there had been a corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay to deny him the presidency. There had been. In those days, being Secretary of State was the path to the presidency. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams had all been Secretary of State before they became president. That was the job you wanted. Jackson had won the popular vote in 1824, but had not won a majority electoral college. It goes to the House of Representatives. Clay, who's run third, Adams had run second. Adams offers Clay the Secretary of State job. Clay throws his support to Adams. Suddenly the winner of the popular vote has lost. Jackson sees conspiracy. The Jacksonian press feeds these conspiracies. All the way through. I mean, you can go all the way up. And the rise of social media has made this more immediate, but the existence of a partisan press is an ancient phenomenon. And in fact, in many ways, the 20th century itself is an exception, not the rule, to a media in America. The 18th and 19th centuries were entirely partisan medias. There was kind of this golden era to some extent, probably from about 1896 when Adolph Ox bought the New York Times through probably the early 1980s. Maybe call it the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in the mid-1980s, which opened the way for talk radio, which opened the way for partisan cable television. 1980, CNN was founded. 1982, 83. I think the first broadcast of Crossfire is a hugely important cultural moment in American political life, because that was on CNN. That was a moment where suddenly you had in vivid manifestation the fiction that there was one view from the right and one view from the left, and there was some poor hapless guest in the middle who was just a prop. We're all that poor hapless guest in the middle. But that was a dominant program. Remember how crazy it was to have this every night, and every night, ripped from the headlines. That was a hugely important shift. And so, and then by 96, you have both MSNBC and Fox doing what they do. And it's largely economic, right? It's very hard for general interest networks or newspapers to package themselves for advertisers anymore, because they can't prove who's reading it or who's watching it. The insight that Roger Ailes had was that, and Rupert Murdoch, was that conservative viewers needed a place where they felt comfortable and affirmed to some extent, and that advertisers would pay to reach those viewers. And whatever else you want to say about those two guys, they were right about that.
We have time for one more question. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Let's talk about Barack Obama. In the beginning of your talk, you talked about how the president is a reflection of his time.
Yeah.
You stopped at Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you think Barack Obama reflects and/or shapes his era?
Yep.
And the second question has to do with how we're throwing my brother on the 20 offs to put Harriet Tubman on. And he wanted us to be careful about our particular historical moment, what we're missing at this moment. And I would suggest that, I would ask you whether or not you think the Christian teaching that the first shall be last and the last shall be first can help us out here.
Well, I was a print journalist, so the last shall be first is my only hope. So there's that. Let me do the first one first. I stopped at Clinton because of my friend Michael Beschloss, whom I hope you all know and admire as much as I do. Michael has a rule that you only move from journalism to history after about 20 years. And so I don't comment that much on President Bush 43 or President Obama, because we don't quite have a lot of proportion yet. But look, President Obama is going to be discussed and dissected as long as the English language is spoken in any corner of the globe, as Churchill once said in another context. It's a remarkable life story. It's a remarkable life of achievement. You can argue with all sorts of things that he did and left undone. He's going to have an open historical account to reckon with on Syria and Iraq and the Iran nuclear deal. His legacy will be determined to some extent by events now beyond his control because of decisions he made. But I think that the essential grace and calm he brought to 08, 09 is something that we now forget, in part because the historical market tends to discount and not give enough credit to trouble averted, right? So by avoiding a deepening of the crisis, and by building in many ways on what President Bush did. President Bush gets, I think, credit for that as well. But see, President Bush won't actually get credit for that because all people are going to say is this happened on his watch, right? So Bush won't get credit for TARP and dealing with the crisis, and then Obama did what he did. I always loved, one of the things I'm doing, by the way, and I hope you all will sign this petition later, I'm starting a petition simply to keep Joe Biden around. I want him... My view is that we should just all chip in and give him a car and driver, and just have him drive around, because he'll be fine. But Biden's great line on the campaign trail in the re-election, which was Detroit is alive and Osama bin Laden is dead. Pretty good way of summarizing it. So I think Obama's going to be. It's unclear now where he'll rank, but his biography, the fact of him, is such that he'll be a dominant figure for a long time, and I suspect will be judged very favorably in the fullness of time. But those three issues are big, right? I mean, his decision not to intervene in Syria, the decision to do the Iran deal, and pulling out of Iraq are going to be issues that are going to be unfolding. In the same way George W. Bush is forever going to be accountable for Iraq itself, President Obama has these open issues. Now on Jackson, I think I'm understanding. My own view of this, of the mechanics of memory, the mechanics of commemoration, is that you should judge the motives of the people who were doing the commemorating at the time. And so, if a Confederate flag went up over a courthouse or a state capitol in 1955, it's not that hard to figure out what it was about. So take the damn thing down. If there's a statue to a Confederate soldier in a Confederate cemetery in my old hometown in Chattanooga, and nobody's noticed it, except to point it out that it's a Confederate statue and it's just of a generic person, I probably wouldn't get all excited about it. And so I think this is case by case. I'm sorry, and so on the currency, I don't understand why we can't just have different faces on the same denomination. Aren't there more than like 5 people we want to commemorate? I would think so. Jackson as ever, but Hamilton was supposed to go. I'll leave you with this. I mean, Hamilton was supposed to go, and he got saved by Broadway. So I guess the point here is, if Holden had looked better in his leather pants, maybe Andrew Jackson would have survived on the 20. And that brings us full circle.